Ethan Parker, a dedicated head of internal affairs at the Sacramento Police Department, who finds himself facing a complex set of challenges. At first glance, he appears to be the quiet, steady hand within the system, working tirelessly, yet often feeling alone in his mission to uphold fairness and accountability. Everything begins to change when a routine traffic stop goes awry, and Ethan encounters a police officer whose conduct sparks deep questions. Instead of walking away, Ethan chooses to confront what he discovers, setting him on a journey that will test his resolve, his values, and the very assumptions he holds about his department. As you follow Ethan's path, you will see him grapple with entrenched resistance within law enforcement, the cautious skepticism of a wounded community, and his own doubts about whether lasting reform is even possible. You will watch him navigate subtle acts of defiance and unexpected gestures of support, both from unlikely allies and from those he thought he knew well. At the heart of it all lies a single question: can empathy, understanding, and trust take root where distrust and secrecy have long flourished? Ethan Parker gripped the steering wheel and felt the hum of his car's engine beneath his fingertips. It was late afternoon, and the Sacramento sky hung in a pale blue wash, the warm air carrying the scent of sun-baked asphalt. He was on his way home after a long day at the Internal Affairs Division of the Sacramento Police Department, where he served as the head investigator. Despite his position, Ethan's life away from the office was quiet and solitary. He lived alone in a modest apartment downtown. The small living room offered a single gray couch, a coffee table scattered with old case files, and a bookshelf half filled with reports he meant to read. He did not host many visitors. In truth, he preferred the calm after hours. But calm was not what he felt this particular afternoon. Traffic drifted lazily, and Ethan's thoughts turned to the day's work. He had spent hours reviewing complaints against officers, trying to sort out truths from half-truths. It weighed on him. He cared deeply about fairness and believed that the badge should be a symbol of trust, not fear. He tried to keep personal feelings out of it, but the whisper of cynicism had begun to settle in his mind over the years. He feared that accountability and integrity were dwindling, replaced by a culture of silence and shrugged shoulders. Still, he reminded himself, progress was possible if he stayed vigilant, if he did not give up. He slowed as he approached an intersection. The light flickered from green to yellow. He eased on the brakes, determined to follow every rule. Then it turned red, and he stopped completely. At that moment, bright blue and red lights flashed behind him. A patrol car's siren wailed, cutting through the late afternoon hush. Ethan's heart sank. He had not done anything wrong, he was certain of that. Yet he knew how these stops could go. He knew from countless interviews and testimonies that a simple traffic stop could turn into a confrontation. He pulled to the curb and rolled down his window. A uniformed officer approached, badge gleaming, expression set. The officer was in his mid-30s, with a strong build and a confident stride. His nameplate read, Officer Bradley Lawson. He barked for license and registration. Ethan complied calmly, though a wave of unease passed through him. There was something about the way Lawson looked at him, a silent presumption that Ethan was not worthy of the benefit of the doubt. Ethan had seen that look before, in other cases, in other complaints that crossed his desk. As Ethan handed over his documents, he asked quietly, "Is there a reason for stopping me, officer?" Lawson leaned closer, his voice tense. "You did not come to a full stop." Ethan frowned. "I am fairly certain I did, but you are welcome to check." He tried to keep his tone steady and respectful. But Lawson's eyes narrowed, as if searching for something more, as if he expected resistance. The officer asked odd questions about where Ethan was heading, where he was from. The conversation shifted from a traffic matter to something else entirely, as though Lawson were determined to find a flaw or a reason to escalate. Ethan felt the tension build inside him, a knot forming in his chest. His position at Internal Affairs gave him insight into what could happen next. Some officers, threatened by a citizen's calmness, might push harder. Ethan measured his words carefully. This was no time to reveal who he was. He wanted to see this interaction for what it was, to understand how easily a routine stop could deteriorate. He remained calm, polite, but every polite reply seemed to irritate Lawson further. The officer ordered him out of the car. Ethan obliged, stepping onto the sidewalk and placing his hands where Lawson could see them. He felt the weight of the moment, and a quiet disappointment welled within him. After all these years trying to improve the department from the inside, here he stood, subjected to suspicion without cause. He expected hostility, perhaps even a search. He braced himself. But then, something unexpected happened. From the corner of his eye, he noticed a woman walking her dog on the opposite side of the street. She stopped and looked on, concerned. She did not shout or interfere, but she met Ethan's eyes with a kind, sympathetic gaze. Her face conveyed understanding and support. In that moment, Ethan realized someone recognized what was happening. She saw him not as a threat, but as a human being caught in an uncomfortable situation. She gave a slight nod, as if to say, "I see you. You are not alone." That small, silent kindness steadied Ethan. He felt a measure of warmth bloom inside. He remembered why he was doing this work, why he cared about reform. It was for people like this bystander, for everyone who deserved police force they could trust. He drew a careful breath and maintained his composure. Lawson was growing frustrated that he could not provoke a reaction from Ethan. After a fruitless pat-down, he stepped back, huffing. When Ethan asked if he could have his documents back and continue on his way, Lawson hesitated. He seemed to want one last show of power. He glanced at Ethan's license, then at Ethan's face. The longer silence stretched, the more obvious it became that Lawson had nothing on him. Before the tension snapped, Ethan spoke softly. "Officer Lawson, I think it is time you know who I am." He reached into his pocket, carefully removing a leather wallet that held his Internal Affairs badge. He opened it, letting the officer see the gleaming emblem. Ethan Parker, Head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division. Lawson's eyes went wide, his bravado wavering. He took a step back, blinking in disbelief. "You are Internal Affairs," he stammered. "Yes," Ethan said simply, "and I oversee matters of officer conduct. I ensure that the badge stands for integrity and not intimidation." For a moment, the street was silent except for the quiet rustle of leaves in the warm breeze. The woman with the dog still watched, making no sound, but her presence felt like a gentle anchor. Lawson's face grew pale, and he struggled to maintain composure. He returned Ethan's license and registration with trembling hands. Ethan took them, placed them back in his car, and said evenly, "I will be following up on this, Officer Lawson." As Ethan climbed back into his vehicle, he looked once more to the bystander who had offered that kind, understanding gaze. Without words, he thanked her in his mind. Driving away, he carried that small spark of empathy with him. It was a reminder that even in the face of hostility, there were always those who believed in fairness and decency. He would take this memory with him into the days ahead. It would guide him as he pressed for reforms, as he challenged complacency and silence within the department. He would remember that small kindness from a stranger and let it fortify his resolve. Ethan woke the next morning in his modest apartment, the early sunlight filtering through thin blinds and drawing pale stripes across his living room floor. He had spent a restless night reliving the traffic stop, thinking about Officer Lawson's attitude and the silent, watchful presence of that kind stranger. Now, as he prepared himself for another day at Internal Affairs, he felt a mixture of determination and weariness. He kept his apartment tidy, but sparse. A small kitchen with outdated cabinets, a plain bedroom with a single dresser and a bed, and a living area dominated by his work files. The decor was minimal, as if he had never fully settled in. He had moved here from another state a year ago, after receiving the job offer at Internal Affairs. Since then, his life had become a pattern of long days and quiet evenings. He had not made many friends, nor had he invited family to visit. His work had become his purpose, and he believed it mattered, though he sometimes longed for a gentler personal life. As he dressed in crisp shirt and slacks, Ethan replayed the event with Officer Lawson. He had encountered many officers who bristled at oversight, but Lawson's behavior seemed fueled by assumption and bias. The fact that Ethan had to reveal his rank just to gain respect troubled him deeply. Was the uniform so easily misused? Did years of training and policies mean nothing if an officer held personal prejudices? He intended to dig into Lawson's record and the broader patterns at the department. It was time to move beyond handling things quietly. The community deserved better. By the time he arrived at his office, the Sacramento sun was already heating the sidewalks. The building that housed Internal Affairs was functional and unadorned, a place for paperwork and quiet interviews rather than public display. Inside, Ethan's small office contained a desk with neatly stacked files, a computer that hummed softly, and a window overlooking a busy street. His assistant, Linda Gray, soon knocked and entered with a stack of documents under one arm. "Morning, Ethan," Linda said, placing the files on his desk. She was a calm presence in the office, patient and meticulous. She had seen Ethan come and go with stern concentration, and while she respected his professionalism, she had also noticed the strain in his eyes lately. She reached into her tote bag and took out a small container. "I brought you some herbal tea. Thought you might want something different for a change." Ethan blinked, surprised. "That is very kind of you, Linda. Thank you." He took the container and held it for a moment. The gesture was so simple, yet it soothed him. In the midst of tension and suspicion, here was a moment of warmth. He realized he often overlooked these quiet acts of consideration. In a role so focused on wrongdoing, he sometimes forgot that people could choose kindness just as easily as indifference. As he sipped the tea, Ethan opened the first of the new files. Officer Lawson's record was already in his mind, and he searched through their database to find any past complaints. Sure enough, there were several minor ones: allegations of unprofessional conduct, vague accusations of aggressive stops, and complaints that had been filed away without thorough investigation. Nothing major, but a pattern emerged. Ethan frowned as he considered how these small issues, left unchecked, might have led to yesterday's incident. He made an appointment to speak with Chief Daniel Miller. The chief had been in the department for decades, a seasoned veteran who believed in keeping matters quiet and handling problems internally. Ethan knew he would face resistance. The chief valued the image of the department. Public scandals would weaken trust, he believed. Ethan disagreed. He thought silence caused rot from within. Later that morning, Ethan sat across from Chief Miller in the older man's office. Miller's office was spacious and decorated with awards and photographs of community events long past. The chief listened as Ethan described the traffic stop with Lawson and the concerns it raised. Miller rubbed his temples and sighed. "Ethan, we have had issues with Lawson before. We always handled it quietly. I understand your concerns, but do we really need to stir the pot?" Ethan met the chief's gaze, unflinching. "Yes, we do. If we cannot hold ourselves accountable, how can we ask the public to trust us?" Miller frowned. He was not accustomed to such directness from someone in internal affairs. "There is a process, Ethan. We need to be cautious." Cautiousness had done little to solve these issues, Ethan thought. Instead of letting the discussion devolve, he held his resolve firmly. "I respect your position, Chief, but we must be transparent. If we do not address misconduct thoroughly, it does not disappear. It grows." Miller's lips tightened. He did not dismiss Ethan's arguments, but he did not embrace them either. "Fine," he finally said. Write up your report. Let us keep it internal for now. We will see if we can resolve it without a public spectacle." Ethan left the meeting feeling only partially successful. He knew that true change would require more than a single conversation. He returned to his office and found Linda waiting with a new stack of papers. She smiled at him kindly. "Any progress?" "Some, maybe," Ethan replied, settling behind his desk. "The tea you gave me earlier was nice. I appreciate that you thought of it." Linda nodded, understanding that even small kindnesses could carry great weight. That afternoon, Ethan immersed himself in research. He found patterns in old complaints. He noticed a lack of follow-up in many cases. It was not that the department refused to hold anyone accountable, but they seemed more inclined to minimize issues. Ethan wondered what would happen if he brought these patterns into the open. He imagined pushback from officers who believed internal affairs was out to get them. But he also imagined the faces of those who would be relieved to see steps toward fairness. He remembered the stranger who had watched him during the traffic stop and how her presence had comforted him. He thought of Linda's kindness, of small acts that gave him strength. Maybe he was not alone in wanting a better standard. Perhaps there were others, inside and outside the department, who would join him if he led the way. Ethan wrote late into the evening, drafting recommendations for a department-wide review. He planned to propose mentorship programs, improved training on cultural sensitivity, and transparent complaint handling. He understood it would not be easy, but he believed it was right. Before leaving his office, he paused to look out the window at the street below. Cars passed, lights changed, and people walked along the sidewalks. Life kept moving. As he turned off his desk lamp, Ethan resolved to keep pushing. He thought again about how small gestures of kindness could help him persevere. He would not let cynicism settle in his heart. He would keep working, believing that quiet acts of goodwill could pave the way toward meaningful change. The following morning, Ethan arrived at the office earlier than usual. He carried a renewed sense of purpose with him, even though he knew the road ahead would be difficult. He wanted to find allies, people who shared his vision of a more accountable, transparent police department. He sifted through old contacts, recalling officers who had shown fairness and empathy in their dealings. If he could show that some within the force supported reform, the chief might be more receptive. As he reviewed personnel files, a soft knock sounded at his door. Ethan looked up to see Officer Luis Ramirez, a patrolman in his early 30s, standing there with a polite smile. Ramirez was someone Ethan did not know well, but he remembered the officer had once testified truthfully in a difficult misconduct case. It had impressed Ethan at the time. "Good morning, sir," Ramirez said, stepping inside. "I hope I am not interrupting. I had a question about the proper way to document certain civilian interactions. I want to make sure I'm doing everything by the book." Ethan gestured for him to enter. "Not interrupting at all, Officer Ramirez. Please have a seat." He pulled out a chair and listened as Ramirez described a recent encounter with a driver who seemed confused by procedure. Ramirez wanted to ensure he had handled the interaction correctly and filed the appropriate report. As they discussed policy details, Ethan felt a sense of relief. Here was an officer who cared about getting things right. He was not defensive or suspicious. He simply wanted to follow proper protocols and ensure fairness. Ethan answered his questions and clarified some points. Before leaving, Ramirez hesitated and then said quietly, "I have heard rumors about some changes you might be proposing. I just want to say that I appreciate what you are trying to do. Some of us believe that holding ourselves accountable helps the entire department. It makes it easier to do our jobs well, you know?" Ethan took a moment to let those words settle. "Thank you, Officer Ramirez. Your support means a lot. I believe we can do better, and it starts with officers like you who welcome integrity." Ramirez nodded. "Maybe if more people see the benefits, they will come around. Keep at it, sir." He departed, leaving Ethan alone with a brighter outlook. This was unexpected kindness of a different sort. Not just compassion, but professional support and understanding. It reassured Ethan that his efforts might not fall on deaf ears. That afternoon, Ethan dug deeper into department archives. He pulled old files, read complaints that never reached formal hearings, and looked for patterns in disciplinary actions. He found that most complaints were dismissed early. Minor issues were rarely addressed beyond a verbal warning. Over time, this had likely encouraged a sense that small transgressions carried no consequences. His mind drifted to Officer Lawson again. If Lawson had faced earlier consequences or been guided into corrective training, perhaps he would not have felt so free to profile a driver and escalate tensions. Ethan suspected that too many people turned a blind eye, allowing unhealthy attitudes to flourish. This needed to change. Later in the day, Ethan stepped outside to clear his head. He took a short walk around the block, passing coffee shops and small offices. Across the street, a community center displayed a poster for a public forum on police community relations. He paused to read it. The forum was scheduled in 2 days. He wondered if attending might help him understand the public's perspective better. He knew the community's trust was essential. Without it, the badge lost meaning. As Ethan considered attending the forum, a voice behind him said, "Thinking of stopping by?" Ethan turned to see Caroline Park, a community organizer he recognized from a previous neighborhood meeting. She had long, dark hair and a kind smile. He remembered her name from reports he had read. She often worked with youth and tried to open dialogue with the police department. "I might," Ethan said, offering a polite nod. "I am Ethan Parker, head of internal affairs for the department." Caroline smiled, not seeming surprised. "I know who you are. I saw you at a meeting last year, though we did not speak. I remember you asked pointed questions about accountability. Are you thinking of joining the forum to hear what residents have to say?" "Yes, I think it would help," Ethan replied. "There are things happening in the department that concern me. I want to understand what the public experiences and expects." Caroline's voice was gentle. "I appreciate that. People here have a lot to say, and not all of it is pleasant. But if you come to listen and not to judge, I think you will gain a lot." She paused, then added, "It is good to see someone inside the system who cares enough to step forward. You will be welcome if you choose to join us." That simple acceptance, that note of encouragement, lifted Ethan's spirits. He realized how rarely he had engaged with the community directly. He had been so immersed in the internal workings of the department that he had not fully understood the human impact of officer conduct. Caroline's willingness to bridge that gap was another instance of kindness, one that he was grateful for. Back at the office, he decided he would indeed attend the forum. He would go not as a figure of authority trying to control the narrative, but as a listener. He believed that understanding the public's concerns would help shape more meaningful reforms. He made a note in his calendar. Before the day ended, Linda stepped in with a small plate of cookies she had picked up on her lunch break. "I thought you might want a snack," she said cheerfully. Ethan smiled. "Thank you, Linda. You have been kind these last few days, and I appreciate it." As Linda left, Ethan considered how these small gestures, Ramirez's support, Caroline's invitation, Linda's thoughtful acts, were helping him maintain focus. In a job where he dealt with complaints and misconduct, it was easy to become bitter or detached. Yet these encounters showed him that not everyone was indifferent. Some wanted the same thing he did, a department worthy of the community's trust. He spent the last hour of the workday drafting an initial outline for his reforms. He would propose a department-wide review, training programs emphasizing cultural awareness, open community forums, and a transparent system for handling complaints. He knew the chief and some officers would resist, but now he believed he had reason to hope. As he turned off his computer and locked the office door behind him, Ethan felt a small but growing sense of purpose. He would not be fighting alone. There were officers, community members, and colleagues who understood what he was trying to do, and they would guide him through this process with their own quiet acts of kindness, fueling his resolve. The next evening, Ethan found himself seated in a folding chair at the community center. The public forum was about to begin, and the room was filling with residents, activists, local business owners, and a few off-duty officers. The walls were decorated with colorful murals of Sacramento's diverse neighborhoods, and a row of long tables held pamphlets about community services. Ethan wore a simple shirt and jacket, nothing that highlighted his role in internal affairs. He was here to learn, not to intimidate. Caroline Park spotted him and offered a smile and a nod from across the room. He nodded back, grateful to have at least one friendly face here. The forum opened with a greeting from a local pastor, Reverend Thomas Harvey, who served as a community leader and mediator. The Reverend's voice was calm and reassuring. He urged everyone to speak honestly but respectfully. "We can solve nothing without listening," he said. "Let us understand each other." For the first hour, people took turns at the microphone, sharing stories. Some described respectful and helpful police officers who had guided them through difficult moments. Others, however, recounted stops that felt unfair, searches that felt aggressive, and a lingering fear they carried with them whenever they saw flashing lights. Ethan listened quietly, taking mental notes. He heard frustration and disappointment, but also a desire for a better relationship with the police. The community did not hate the department. They were hurt and wanted trust. Midway through the forum, Caroline encouraged Ethan to share his perspective. He approached the microphone reluctantly, introducing himself by name and position. The room grew quiet. He explained that he worked within internal affairs, reviewing cases of misconduct. He acknowledged that the department had more work to do. He said he was here because he wanted to learn how to serve the community better, to understand what needed changing. His admission brought mixed reactions. Some people eyed him warily, uncertain if his words were genuine. Others seemed relieved that someone in his position had bothered to show up. Before he left the microphone, Ethan added, "I know trust must be earned, not requested. I do not expect immediate acceptance. I only ask that you do not give up on the possibility of meaningful change." As he stepped away, Reverend Harvey offered a small smile and a supportive nod. After the official session ended, the attendees broke into smaller groups. Ethan drifted from one cluster to another, listening, occasionally answering polite questions. People asked him about how complaints were handled, how officers were trained, and why transparency was so hard to achieve. Ethan answered honestly, explaining the bureaucratic hurdles and the resistance to change. He did not make excuses. He simply showed them he understood their concerns. Unexpected kindness emerged from these conversations. A local shop owner, Mrs. Long, patted Ethan's arm and said, "It gives me hope to see someone from your side of the fence willing to hear us out." Another community member, a teenager named Marcus, told Ethan he once encountered an officer who helped him finish a college application when he could not find his way to a library computer. "Not every officer was a bully," Marcus said, "and that was what kept him from losing faith altogether." This kindness from ordinary citizens touched Ethan deeply. It reminded him that positive stories existed, though they were often overshadowed by negative experiences. These moments could be used as examples of what good policing looked like, if only the department learned from them. It gave him material he could bring back to the office, to show that while people were angry, they still believed in the potential for improvement. At the end of the evening, Caroline approached Ethan. "So what did you think?" He took a breath. "I learned a lot. I heard people's pain and fear, but also their willingness to meet us halfway if we show genuine reform. This helps me understand what steps might work and how to frame them." Caroline looked pleased. "Good. Use what you learned wisely. And remember, change takes time, but it also takes courage. We need people on the inside who are not afraid to challenge the status quo." Ethan nodded. "Thank you for inviting me here, Caroline. I appreciate your help." As he left the community center, he felt a mix of emotions. He was encouraged by the kindness and openness he had encountered, but also sobered by the gravity of the community's distrust. He had a clearer picture now of the stakes involved. Back at the office the next day, Ethan compiled his notes from the forum. He added these community perspectives to his recommendations. He proposed more direct interaction between officers and residents, not just formal meetings, but mentorship programs for local youth, ride-alongs for community leaders, and workshops where officers would learn about cultural sensitivity and de-escalation techniques. Before finalizing his proposals, Ethan requested a meeting with Chief Miller. Linda, noticing his serious expression, offered him a cup of coffee. "You look determined, Mr. Parker. I hope everything goes well." "Thank you, Linda. Your kindness keeps me going." She smiled. "Just doing my part." Later that afternoon, Ethan sat across from Chief Miller again. This time, he spoke with conviction and evidence. He described the patterns he had found in complaint files, the impressions he gathered at the forum, and the support he knew existed among certain officers, like Ramirez. He emphasized that reform was not an attack on good policing, but a path to strengthen it. Miller listened with narrowed eyes, tapping a pen against the table. "You want to open doors that have been closed for a long time, Ethan." "Yes, I do," Ethan replied. "Keeping them closed has not served us. And if we do not address this problem now, it will only get worse." The chief said nothing for a long moment, considering Ethan's words. Then he nodded slowly. "Very well. Prepare your recommendations for departmental review. We will see how this unfolds." Ethan left the meeting feeling cautious optimism. He had not received a firm yes, but he had not been shut down either. The chief might be skeptical, but he was not outright refusing to consider changes. As evening fell, Ethan returned home and looked around his small apartment. He felt less alone than before. The simple acts of kindness he had encountered from Linda, Ramirez, Caroline, Reverend Harvey, and even the supportive community members had buoyed him. They proved that he was part of something larger, a collective push for integrity and understanding. He sank onto his couch, the darkness outside settling over Sacramento's streets. He knew this was only the beginning, and the path ahead might be filled with opposition. But he also understood that perseverance guided by empathy and goodwill could make the impossible possible. He would rest tonight and continue pushing tomorrow, fueled by the quiet strength of those who believed in him. Over the next week, Ethan dedicated himself to refining his recommendations for department-wide reforms. He poured through training manuals, disciplinary guidelines, and past community reports. He wanted to create a comprehensive approach that addressed not just individual misconduct, but the underlying culture that allowed it to fester. Meanwhile, the hearing regarding Officer Lawson's conduct was scheduled. As the head of internal affairs, Ethan would oversee the proceedings. He spent hours reviewing statements and evidence. Lawson's record showed a pattern of small but telling lapses. Nothing had been fully addressed. Each time, the department had given him the benefit of the doubt without demanding improvement. On the day of the hearing, Lawson entered the small conference room in his uniform, jaw tight, eyes wary. Ethan sat at a table facing him, along with two other members of the review panel. The atmosphere was tense. Lawson tried to justify his behavior during the traffic stop, claiming he felt something was off, that he had acted out of caution. He avoided admitting to profiling or unnecessary escalation. Ethan kept his tone measured. "Officer Lawson, your record indicates recurring complaints of unprofessional behavior. These were never meaningfully addressed. Perhaps if they had been, we would not be here today. The community expects better, and so does this department." Lawson bristled, but he could not ignore the evidence before him. He shifted in his seat, his confidence slipping. Ethan knew that punishing Lawson alone would not solve the bigger issue. But accountability was a necessary step. Officers who mistreated citizens needed consequences. At the end of the hearing, Lawson received a suspension pending remedial training. It was not the end of the line for him, but a chance to learn. Whether he would take that chance remained to be seen. After the hearing, Ethan felt drained. The tension of the encounter weighed on him. He left the building to clear his head and found Reverend Thomas Harvey waiting outside, having observed part of the process as a community representative. The Reverend approached him quietly. "That was not easy," the Reverend said softly. "I see that you handled it firmly but fairly." Ethan sighed. "I hope it makes a difference. So many cases end quietly, with no lasting changes." The Reverend placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder in a comforting gesture. "Change often begins in uncomfortable moments. You are doing what you can. Keep going." This simple reassurance mattered. Ethan realized that the Reverend's presence was another example of unexpected kindness, a moral support that acknowledged the difficulty of what he was doing. The encouragement gave him strength. There were people who appreciated the struggle for fairness, even if progress came slowly. Back in his office, Ethan revisited his notes from the community forum and the conversations with Ramirez. He decided it was time to reach out to Dr. Michelle Winters, a psychologist who specialized in organizational culture within law enforcement. He had heard of her work before, but had never consulted her directly. If the department was to embark on real reform, they needed guidance from an expert who understood the psychological dimensions of policing. Dr. Winters agreed to meet Ethan at his office the following day. She listened as he explained the problems he saw and the changes he wanted to implement. She commended him for trying to address root causes rather than just punishing bad actors. Dr. Winters suggested targeted training sessions focusing on empathy, community engagement, and stress management for officers. She also offered to provide counseling services at a reduced rate, knowing budget constraints could be an obstacle. This was yet another act of kindness, a professional extending help beyond what was required. Ethan thanked her sincerely. He saw that with the right allies, the reforms would have a better chance of success. Dr. Winters understood that building trust required human connection, not just written directives. As the week progressed, Ethan refined his proposals to include Dr. Winters' suggestions. He also planned a series of meetings within the department where officers could share their concerns and hopes. He believed that if the department understood the purpose behind the reforms, fewer would resist it. The ultimate goal was to rebuild a culture of integrity and respect, and that required buy-in from within. Still, not everyone welcomed these changes. Ethan learned through the office grapevine that some officers felt threatened. They grumbled that internal affairs was turning into the morality police, that Ethan was trying to paint them all as villains. Ethan understood their fear. Changing long-held habits and perspectives was never easy. That was why the acts of kindness were so important. Without them, Ethan might have felt alone and overwhelmed. He thought of Linda, who quietly supported him by making his workload easier and offering small comforts. He remembered Officer Ramirez, who believed in accountability as a source of strength. He held on to Caroline's encouragement and Reverend Harvey's moral support. These people gave him the courage to stand firm against the inevitable backlash. As he prepared to present his proposals to Chief Miller and eventually the City Council, Ethan steeled himself for the challenges ahead. He carefully outlined training programs, transparent disciplinary procedures, and community outreach initiatives. He knew that real change demanded persistent effort and resilience. Later that evening, after a long day's work, Ethan walked home through the quiet streets. It was dusk, and the sky stretched in soft purples and blues. He passed a mural on a brick wall depicting neighbors smiling and shaking hands with uniformed officers. It struck him as an idealized image of what policing could be at its best. He wanted to make that mural's vision a reality. At home, he settled into his simple apartment, noticing how bare the walls looked. Perhaps one day, he would add more warmth to the place. For now, he took comfort in knowing he was not fighting alone. He had people at his side, each offering something valuable: trust, understanding, encouragement. Ethan recognized that hardship lay ahead, but he also knew that perseverance, guided by empathy and supported by kindness, could push them forward. Even as he faced institutional inertia, he refused to give up. He would keep working to ensure that the badge symbolized safety, not fear. He would prove that small acts of understanding could spark big changes. And if he succeeded, perhaps he could one day look around at the department and see that he had helped build something better, something true to the ideals that had drawn him into law enforcement work in the first place. A week later, the atmosphere at the Sacramento Police Department's Internal Affairs Office was charged with anticipation. Ethan had scheduled a briefing with Chief Miller and a select group of senior officers to present his reform proposals. The stack of documents he carried felt heavy, but not as heavy as the responsibility he bore. This was the next crucial step. Before the meeting, Dr. Michelle Winters arrived at Ethan's office with a thick folder of training outlines. She wore a practical blouse and carried herself with a professional yet compassionate air. "I have prepared detailed suggestions for interactive workshops, mentoring programs, and mandatory sessions on cultural sensitivity and de-escalation," she said. "I have also included optional counseling services for officers dealing with stress or burnout." Ethan flipped through the materials, impressed. This is exactly the kind of detail we need to convince the chief that these reforms can be implemented successfully. Dr. Winters smiled gently. "I hope it helps. Change is never easy, but it can happen if we provide the right tools and support." Shortly after, Linda brought in a fresh pot of coffee and a few printed copies of the proposals for the meeting. She gave Ethan an encouraging nod. "Good luck, Mr. Parker. You have worked so hard on this." He thanked her and felt a quiet warmth inside. The small kindness of her gesture reminded him that he had allies here, even if they were not all decision-makers. The meeting took place in a conference room lined with old photographs of past police chiefs and city officials. Chief Miller sat at the head of the table, arms crossed, face unreadable. Around him were 3 senior officers who would help advise on policy changes. Ethan sensed skepticism in their gazes. He took a steadying breath, remembering the supportive voices that had guided him here. He began by acknowledging that the department had strong traditions and dedicated officers. He emphasized that the goal of these reforms was not to vilify anyone, but to strengthen the bond between the police and the community. He presented statistics, declining public trust, an increase in complaints, and the need to restore integrity. He introduced Dr. Winters' training programs, explaining how they could improve communication, reduce unnecessary confrontations, and foster empathy. For a long time, the room was quiet except for the rustle of papers and the hum of the air conditioning. Finally, one senior officer asked, "How do we measure success?" Ethan answered calmly, "We measure it by reduced complaints, improved community feedback, lower officer burnout, and increased willingness of witnesses to cooperate with police. We can track these metrics over time. If trust rises, everyone benefits." Chief Miller tapped a pen against the table. "These are significant changes, Ethan. Some officers will feel challenged." Ethan nodded. "Yes, they will. But we owe it to the community and to ourselves to hold the badge to a higher standard. If we guide the hesitant officers through training and show them that good policing is respected policing, I believe we can win them over." The chief took another moment of silence, flipping through the pages of the proposal. Then he surprised Ethan by inviting Dr. Winters to speak. The psychologist explained how incremental steps, consistent follow-ups, and support systems for officers could ease the transition. She mentioned that such reforms, while challenging at first, often led to a healthier organizational culture. In the end, the chief did not outright reject the plan. Instead, he agreed to a pilot program. Start with a few units, train them, measure the results, and then consider expanding. It was not the sweeping approval Ethan had hoped for, but it was a start. A crack in the door, an opportunity to prove the reforms could work. After the meeting, Ethan walked Dr. Winters to the lobby. "Thank you for your help. Your expertise made a difference. She smiled. I am glad I could help. Remember, even small steps forward count. With a partial victory in hand, Ethan returned to his office to find Officer Luis Ramirez waiting for him. Ramirez had heard about the meeting and wanted to know how it went. When Ethan told him about the pilot program, Ramirez grinned. That is great news, sir. I know it is not everything you wanted, but it means the door is open. Ethan agreed. Now he had to implement these changes carefully and gather data to show they worked. He felt a sense of cautious optimism. He knew some officers would resist. He knew it would take patience and perseverance. But the green light, however small, was still a step forward. In the following days, Ethan began organizing the first training sessions. Dr. Winters would lead some workshops, and a local expert on conflict resolution would handle others. Ethan reviewed the list of officers selected for the pilot program. He made sure it included a cross-section. Older, younger, different ranks, different backgrounds. He wanted to prove that anyone could learn to improve their approach. Meanwhile, Linda helped by scheduling sessions, sending out notices, and preparing orientation packets. Each time she brought Ethan a cup of coffee or helped him with paperwork, he remembered how these small acts of kindness sustained him. They were reminders that change was not just in grand policies, but in the everyday decency people showed one another. After one long day of planning, Ethan visited the break room. He found a small group of officers discussing the new pilot program. A few of them sounded skeptical, claiming it was just a fad or an unnecessary intrusion. But Ramirez spoke up, saying, "We all signed up to serve and protect. If this helps us serve better, why not give it a chance?" Hearing Ramirez stand up for the reforms made Ethan hopeful. He did not need every officer to believe right away. He just needed enough support to get the ball rolling, to show that positive changes produced real results. That evening, Ethan took a walk through his neighborhood. He passed a small park where children were playing under their parents' watchful eyes. A patrol car rolled slowly by, the officer inside giving a friendly wave to the kids. It was a scene that mirrored the kind of future Ethan wanted for the whole city. Respectful interactions, trust built step by step, fear replaced by a sense of partnership. He thought back to the stranger who had offered him a kind look during the difficult traffic stop, to the community members who shared their hopes and concerns, to Ramirez, Linda, Caroline, and Dr. Winters. All of them contributed to this moment, fueling his resolve. Change was underway. Slowly, carefully, he was reshaping the way the department worked and thought. He understood that there were no quick fixes. Real reform took time, persistence, and often patience in the face of doubt. But Ethan was determined to see it through. He would persevere, guided by kindness and anchored by the belief that people could learn, grow, and heal. A month passed, and the pilot program was underway. The selected officers attended the first round of training sessions led by Dr. Winters and other specialists. They learned about communication techniques, understanding cultural differences, and managing stress in high-pressure encounters. There were moments of awkwardness, resentment, and confusion, but also moments of discovery and progress. Ethan checked in frequently, observing a few sessions and reviewing feedback forms. Some officers admitted they found the training helpful. Others were resistant, but they showed up. Attendance alone was a small victory. One afternoon, Ethan stopped by a training session just as it ended. Most officers filed out quietly, but Ramirez lingered behind. Spotting Ethan at the doorway, Ramirez approached him, smiling. "These workshops are interesting. I never thought about how much nonverbal cues affect how people perceive us. I realize that I can show respect without saying a word, just by how I stand, how I listen." Ethan nodded. "That is encouraging. If you find value, I am sure others will too. We just need time." Ramirez lowered his voice, glancing around. "Some of the older guys are still complaining, but I think they are starting to see that no one is attacking them personally. We are just learning how to be better at our jobs." Ethan thanked him and promised to keep supporting the program. As he headed back to his office, he felt a surge of optimism. Maybe these sessions, coupled with consistent follow-through, would begin changing the culture. He could imagine a future where officers treated every citizen with respect, and the community responded with trust. But he was not naive. He knew skepticism remained. Later that day, a small group of officers gathered in a hallway corner, whispering about how internal affairs was trying to fix what was not broken. Ethan overheard them as he passed. He did not confront them. He understood that fear and defensiveness were part of the process. Real change threatened comfortable habits. That evening, Ethan decided to give himself a brief break. He accepted an invitation from Linda, who had organized a small neighborhood cookout at her apartment complex. Normally, Ethan would avoid social events. He was private, preferring solitude after work. But Linda had been so supportive. He realized part of building trust and understanding involved allowing others to know him as a person, not just as a stern figure behind a desk. At the cookout, neighbors milled about under string lights. There was laughter, music, and the smell of grilled vegetables and chicken. Linda introduced Ethan to her friends, who asked polite questions about his work. They were curious but not judgmental. He met a teacher, a nurse, a taxi driver, people from all walks of life. They spoke about everyday concerns, not official complaints or policies, and it reminded Ethan that these were the people he was ultimately serving. They were not out to get him. They just wanted fairness and safety. One older gentleman, Mr. Carter, told Ethan how he had once feared calling the police when noise in the alley at night worried him. He worried he would not be taken seriously. He wanted to be respected, not brushed off. Ethan listened intently and assured Mr. Carter that steps were being taken to ensure residents felt heard. The man nodded thoughtfully, grateful for the information. As the evening wore on, Ethan relaxed. He laughed at a joke, tried a homemade dessert, and found himself sharing a bit about why he joined internal affairs. He explained how he wanted to help restore faith in the badge. His words were met with warm understanding. He realized that this was kindness too. These neighbors, complete strangers to him until now, opening their circle and treating him not as an official, but as a fellow human being. When he returned home, the loneliness of his apartment felt less heavy. He understood that building connections outside of work could strengthen his perspective. Kindness was not just something he wanted officers to show on duty, it was something he needed in his own life. With renewed determination, Ethan spent the next week analyzing early feedback from the pilot program. Complaints were still coming in, but he noticed a slight change in tone. A few community members mentioned that certain officers had become more patient and respectful during traffic stops. These were small glimmers of hope. Ethan also arranged a meeting with Caroline Park, the community activist. He wanted to inform her of the steps the department was taking so that she could share the information with the residents she worked with. When they met at a local cafe, Caroline listened carefully and nodded. "I am glad to hear about the training sessions and the pilot program," she said. "The community needs to know that this is not just talk, that things are actually happening." Ethan sipped his coffee. "We have a long way to go, but we are committed. Some officers are still unsure, but I believe that results will convince them more than words ever could." Caroline smiled. "Keep us posted. And remember, the community is ready to acknowledge progress if they see genuine effort." Her support, again, felt like a soft, reassuring light. Ethan left the cafe convinced that transparency and outreach were key. He would continue to share updates, to bring the department closer to the people they served. That evening, as he reviewed his notes at home, Ethan noticed a feeling he had not allowed himself in a long time: hope. He had begun this journey deeply troubled by what he saw, discouraged by quiet complicity. But along the way, acts of unexpected kindness and understanding had given him the strength to push forward. Each encouraging moment, Each open-minded officer, each supportive citizen, had become a thread in the fabric of his resilience. Ethan understood that healing would not come overnight. The scars of mistrust ran deep, but they could mend over time if guided by sincerity and care. He vowed to keep persevering, knowing that slow progress was still progress. Every inch they gained toward mutual respect made the badge shine a little brighter. In the quiet of his apartment, Ethan looked out the window at the city lights. He reminded himself that he was no longer working in isolation. He was part of a broader effort, one nourished by the kindness of others. That kindness now flowed through him, allowing him to face the challenges ahead with steady resolve. A few more months passed, and the pilot program continued to unfold. Officers involved in the training began practicing what they had learned. Some community members noticed improvements. Still, challenges remained. Real cultural shifts took time and perseverance. Ethan decided to organize a public town hall to discuss the pilot program's progress. He wanted officers, community leaders, and residents to come together, not as adversaries, but as partners in a shared cause. Chief Miller supported the idea cautiously, and Caroline Park agreed to help publicize the event among local civic groups. The town hall was held in a large auditorium at a local high school. On stage, a panel included Ethan, Chief Miller, Dr. Winters, and two officers from the pilot program, one of them Officer Ramirez. In the audience sat community members, city council representatives, local reporters, and various activists, including Reverend Harvey. The air buzzed with anticipation and a hint of nervousness. Ethan opened with a brief introduction, explaining the changes made: regular training sessions, mentorship programs pairing seasoned officers with new recruits, and improved procedures for filing and investigating complaints. He cited early indicators of progress: a modest decrease in complaints from certain neighborhoods and a few positive testimonials from residents who felt treated fairly at recent traffic stops. Then came the community's turn to speak. A man stepped up to the microphone and acknowledged that while he remained cautious, he appreciated the effort. A young woman said she was glad the police were trying to listen, though she believed more transparency was needed. A local business owner praised the department for hosting these events and asked for more frequent meetings to maintain open communication. A mother of two children stood up and said, "I want to believe in you. My kids deserve a city where they can trust the police. Show me that this is not just a phase, that you are committed for the long haul." Ramirez spoke next, explaining how the training helped him realize that even small gestures like greeting someone warmly could change the tone of an encounter. He admitted that when he first heard about the program, he was skeptical, but seeing positive reactions on the street proved it could make a difference. The audience listened closely. While some remained wary, Ethan noted less hostility in the room. People were starting to see that the department was not fighting these reforms, but rather trying to implement them thoughtfully. He looked at Caroline Park, who sat near the front, and she gave him an encouraging smile. Reverend Harvey also appeared pleased, nodding slowly as he heard the updates. After the event ended, Ethan mingled with attendees in the lobby. A father approached him, pushing a stroller with a toddler inside. He said quietly, "I just want to say thank you. I know things are not perfect, but it feels like we are moving in a better direction. That means a lot to my family." This unexpected kindness touched Ethan. It reminded him that every bit of progress, every show of goodwill, helped mend the frayed trust. He told the father he appreciated his words and hoped to continue improving. The next day, back at the office, Ethan received a visit from Chief Miller. The chief's demeanor had softened slightly over the past few months as he watched the pilot program unfold. "Ethan," he said, "I was impressed by the town hall. People seemed more receptive than I expected." Ethan nodded. "I think they can tell we are sincere. Still, we have to keep delivering results." Miller studied Ethan. "You have put a lot of work into this. I admit I doubted whether these reforms could gain traction, but now I see officers like Ramirez embracing the changes and community members acknowledging progress. We must continue, Ethan said gently. This is just the start. Eventually, I would like to expand the training department wide and institutionalize these policies so they become the norm, not an experiment. Miller considered this, then nodded. We will see how the next round of evaluations goes. If the data supports it, we can consider expanding. Ethan knew this was as close to a full endorsement as he would get right now. He felt grateful that perseverance was paying off. Later, as he passed through the station's corridors, Ethan overheard a conversation between two officers. They were not completely sold on the reforms, but they admitted that the environment felt calmer. Fewer angry confrontations, fewer misunderstandings. Maybe this is not so bad after all, one said. Ethan paused, letting those words sink in. Change, it seemed, was taking root slowly, quietly. At the end of the week, Ethan scheduled a small meeting with Caroline Park and Reverend Harvey. He wanted to keep them informed and gather suggestions on how to maintain the momentum. Over coffee at a local cafe, the three discussed next steps. Caroline said, "We should highlight success stories. Let the community see officers who embraced the training and handled difficult situations with compassion. Give people tangible examples." Reverend Harvey added, "We can also invite community members to ride-alongs or open houses at the station so they can meet officers as people, not just uniforms." Ethan agreed wholeheartedly. He thanked them for their continued support. Both Caroline and Reverend Harvey had been steadfast sources of encouragement. Their kindness, advice, and understanding had helped shape his approach, making it more inclusive and empathetic. That night, Ethan returned home to his apartment with a feeling of cautious optimism. He cooked a simple meal, something he rarely took time for in the past. He realized that his personal life had become a bit more balanced too, with those neighborhood gatherings and meetings forging a sense of connection he previously lacked. As he ate, he considered how far he had come since that afternoon when Officer Lawson pulled him over. Back then, Ethan had felt alone, frustrated, and uncertain whether change was possible. Now, he had allies, strategies, and evidence that positive shifts were unfolding. He had learned that unexpected kindnesses from a nod on the street to generous offers of professional expertise could shape one's perspective and fuel one's resolve. He reminded himself that the journey was not over. Resistance still lingered, improvements were gradual, and trust once broken took time to rebuild. But resilience, perseverance, and kindness had carried them this far. They would carry them further. In that quiet moment, with the hum of the city drifting through his window, Ethan allowed himself to believe in the possibility of lasting change. He saw that the reforms had already touched individual lives, and with patience and commitment, they might transform the entire department and community. He was ready to continue pushing forward, no matter how long it took. As the pilot program approached the 6-month mark, Ethan reviewed the preliminary data. Complaints against the officers who participated in the training had decreased slightly. Surveys from community members suggested a modest improvement in trust. These were small wins, but wins nonetheless. He shared the findings with Chief Miller, who agreed to expand the training to more units. It was not a full overhaul yet, but each step forward reassured Ethan that they were on the right path. The chief even mentioned forming a committee to oversee ongoing cultural improvements, with representatives from both the department and the community. Despite the progress, not everything went smoothly. Some officers still grumbled. Others complied with the training, but did so grudgingly, hoping it would all blow over. Ethan accepted that not everyone would embrace change wholeheartedly. He focused on those who showed willingness and those who remained neutral, believing that over time, positive results would win more converts. In the midst of this work, Linda noticed Ethan looked tired one afternoon. Are you okay? You have been working non-stop. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. I am fine, just a bit drained. The constant push for change is exhausting, even when it goes relatively well. Linda stepped forward, genuine concern in her eyes. Why not take a day off? Go somewhere nice. Clear your head. Ethan hesitated. Taking a day off felt self-indulgent, but maybe Linda was right. He needed balance to maintain resilience. If he burned out, who would continue driving these reforms forward? After some thought, he requested a personal day. He decided to visit a small coastal town about an hour's drive away. The next morning, he set out early, letting the changing scenery soothe him. He arrived at a quiet beach lined with driftwood and seagrass. The salty breeze and gentle crash of waves offered a welcome break from city life and police station corridors. As he strolled along the shore, he reflected on the unexpected kindness that had supported him throughout this journey. He thought of the stranger who had acknowledged his ordeal at the traffic stop, of Linda's unwavering help, Officer Ramirez's open-mindedness, Caroline's guidance, Reverend Harvey's steady moral support, and Dr. Winters's professional generosity. Without these touches of humanity, he might have given up. He realized that the heart of these reforms was not about rules on paper, but about reawakening empathy. Officers needed to remember why they served. Citizens needed to feel respected and protected. He wanted to help build an environment where kindness was not an exception, but a norm. By the time he returned to the city that evening, Ethan felt recharged. He went directly to a small community event. Caroline had organized an informal gathering where officers and residents could talk about everyday concerns. The event was held at a local park. Children played nearby, and a simple food stand offered coffee and pastries. Ethan arrived to find Ramirez speaking with a group of teenagers, explaining how police worked and asking what they wanted from local officers. The teens listened intently, and one even asked if there would ever be a youth mentorship program. Ramirez turned to Ethan, as if silently inviting him to join the conversation. Ethan stepped forward and addressed the teens. We are actually discussing the idea of mentorship programs, pairing officers with local youth groups, creating spaces where questions can be asked and answered honestly. Would that interest you? A teenage boy nodded eagerly. If officers got to know us, maybe they would not assume we are up to no good, a girl added, and we would see officers as people, not just uniforms stopping us on the street. This simple exchange highlighted the power of direct contact and honest dialogue. Ethan smiled. I think that can be arranged. Let me work with Ramirez and Caroline to set something up. You can help by telling us what activities you would find helpful. The teenagers grinned, and Ramirez shot Ethan an appreciative glance. It was another step forward, fueled by mutual goodwill. Caroline, who had been talking with a small group of parents, approached them. See what happens when we make space for conversation? She said quietly to Ethan. Small steps lead to bigger changes. Ethan nodded. He felt his heart lighten. He saw that the seeds they planted were beginning to sprout. Sure, some seeds might wither if not tended to, but at least there was now a garden rather than a barren field. As dusk fell and people began drifting home, Ethan stayed behind to help Caroline pack up folding chairs and refreshments. Side by side, they worked quietly. Eventually, Caroline said, I have noticed you seem more at ease than when you first started this process. You look like someone who has found a sense of purpose. Ethan paused, holding a stack of chairs. I think I have. At first, I was driven mostly by duty and frustration. I knew what needed fixing, but I was not sure it could be fixed. Now I see that with patience, open dialogue, and persistent effort, we can make progress. And all those small acts of kindness helped me stay the course. Caroline smiled warmly. That is how true change happens. Not in one dramatic gesture, but through many small ones, each reinforcing the next. When Ethan returned home that evening, he carried a sense of calm satisfaction. The apartment still felt plain, but now he considered making it more welcoming. Maybe hanging a framed print or placing a plant in the corner would make it feel less temporary. He was no longer just passing through life. He was building something both in the department and in himself. He reflected on how challenges had shaped his character. He had started this journey with a heavy heart, deeply worried that he would fail to make any difference. Now, through perseverance and the kindness of others, he had grown more resilient. He understood that change was slow, but possible. He was learning to celebrate small victories and remain patient through setbacks. The next day, he would go back to work, continue the training, collect feedback, and refine policies. He would keep advocating for fairness and empathy. He knew there were still skeptics and that not everyone would praise his efforts. But he also knew that kindness and resolve had brought him this far, and they would guide him to the finish line where a more just and respectful system awaited. Several months later, Ethan stood in the lobby of the Sacramento Police Department, waiting for a public address he was about to give. The reforms had quietly expanded beyond the pilot program. Training sessions were now mandatory for all new recruits, and refresher courses were scheduled for veteran officers. The mentorship program for local youth had begun on a small scale, connecting a handful of teenagers with officers who volunteered their time. Early feedback was encouraging. Chief Miller had given Ethan more latitude to shape these policies, acknowledging that the positive signs could no longer be ignored. Complaints had not vanished, but there was a noted improvement in the tenor of community interactions. The City Council had approved budget allocations for ongoing training and community outreach, further solidifying the changes. Ethan took a deep breath and stepped out into the station's courtyard, where a modest crowd had gathered. Among them were Caroline Park, Reverend Harvey, Dr. Winters, Officer Ramirez, Linda, and even a few residents he recognized from the forums. He spotted the father who had spoken kindly to him at the town hall, and the teenagers who wanted mentorship. He felt their support like a steady hand on his back. Clearing his throat, Ethan began to speak. He explained the journey of the past months, how the department faced its shortcomings and chose to engage rather than retreat. He emphasized that none of these improvements happened overnight or through the effort of one individual. It took an entire community, officers, residents, city leaders, and advocates working together, guided by perseverance and kindness. As he spoke, he remembered the initial traffic stop with Officer Lawson. He recalled feeling disheartened, unsure if change was possible. Now, he understood that moment had sparked something crucial. It revealed the urgency of reform and led him down a path where he found unexpected allies. A painful encounter had inspired deeper empathy and driven him to seek better solutions. He finished by saying, "True justice is not only about enforcing laws, it is also about building trust, showing compassion, and respecting the dignity of every person. We have started to turn a corner. We have a long road ahead, but we walk it together." The audience applauded. Ethan saw faces reflecting hope and cautious optimism. Some officers nodded thoughtfully. Caroline gave him a thumbs up. Linda beamed with pride. Ramirez, standing near a few officers who had been through the training, clapped loudly, as if acknowledging that their efforts were finally bearing fruit. After the address, people mingled in the courtyard. Ethan shook hands with community members who thanked him for listening. A couple of officers approached to say that while it took time to adjust, they now saw the merit in the reforms. One admitted that the training helped him handle a tense situation more calmly, preventing it from escalating. Another said she felt more appreciated by residents who noticed her efforts. Ethan's heart warmed. Each story, each acknowledgement of improvement, was another piece of evidence that they were on the right path. He thanked everyone for their patience and support, knowing that he did not achieve this alone. He had been led and sustained by countless acts of kindness and understanding, large and small. Before leaving, Reverend Harvey caught Ethan's arm. "You have done well, son. This is what it means to truly serve." Ethan looked around, taking in the modest crowd and the subtle shift in atmosphere. People were not staring each other down with suspicion. They were talking, smiling, and finding common ground. "Thank you, Reverend," he said softly. "Your encouragement meant more than you know." Caroline, standing nearby, added, "You took a difficult situation and turned it into an opportunity for growth. We needed someone inside the system who did not give up." Ethan shook her hand. "Your guidance, and that of so many others, helped me see that solutions require us to open doors, not close them." Officer Ramirez approached last, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I am proud of this department today, and I am proud of what we have done together. I never thought I would see this kind of progress, but you helped make it happen." Ethan smiled, feeling a mix of gratitude and humility. As the crowd dispersed, he realized that the city and its police force had not been transformed overnight into a perfect model of harmony. There would always be challenges. Mistakes would still occur, conflicts would arise, and trust would need constant nurturing. But now they had a framework, a shared understanding that respect and empathy were not optional, but essential. The lessons Ethan learned along the way would remain with him. He understood that people resisted change when they felt attacked or misunderstood, but they softened when met with patience and kindness. He realized that real improvement came from steady, thoughtful work, bolstered by human connection. As he headed home, Ethan imagined how the city might look in a few years. He envisioned fewer complaints, more conversations. He pictured mentorship programs expanding, community events thriving, and a department that prided itself not just on enforcing the law, but on serving the people with fairness and care. Back in his apartment, Ethan considered how much he had grown since that fateful traffic stop. He had been tested by challenges, doubts, and setbacks. But he persevered. He had seen how kindness from unexpected sources could change the direction of a life and an institution. He had discovered that courage was not only in standing up to wrongdoing, but in staying the course even when progress was slow. With that understanding, Ethan Parker rested. He turned off the lights, grateful for the resilience he had found within himself and in others. Tomorrow, he would wake up and continue the work, inspired by the belief that hope could bloom where kindness took root. He carried that message in his heart, ready to nurture it for as long as it took, secure in the knowledge that true change was possible, one compassionate act at a time. If this story touched you, if it reminded you that progress can be made through perseverance, kindness, and genuine understanding, then please consider sharing it with someone who needs to hear these words. Let us keep the conversations going. Let us encourage one another to stand for what is right and just. If you appreciated this story and want to see more like it, please subscribe to our channel. By subscribing, you support the creation of stories that inspire positive change, stories that lift us up and remind us that hope is always within reach. Your support matters. Thank you for being a part of this journey.